بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson number 29, the 29th lesson in our series on Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah. And in the previous lesson, I've given you a sheet, a handout, which kind of summarizes the previous lesson really. So there's two sides. The first is on reason and revelation. Is there conflict or conformity? So at the beginning of the previous lesson, lesson 28, and Qadar Allah, we don't have the recording. That recording turned up being blank because of a mistake in the setting in the recording, so we don't have that recording. But just to kind of really recap the previous lesson, at the beginning I kind of explained the difference between the knowledge that we receive through the prophets and messengers by way of revelation. Revelation is the highest form of report, the highest type of khabar that there can be, because it is the khabar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And within this revelation there is information or khabar about the greatest of all noble things, knowable things, which is Allah. Allah is the greatest of all things which are knowable. And within this revelation, within these reports, there is knowledge of Allah, His names, His attributes. And this knowledge is there to be reflected upon. And through that reflection, through that tadabbur, the hearts develop feelings of love and hope and fear and reliance. And this gives life to the hearts. And upon this is based the tawheed of Allah, Allah's worship. And there is nothing that Allah has described Himself with, or what He's revealed to us about Himself, which can ever be in conflict with reason, with a man's intellect. Right? So there is no conflict between revelation and reason. Rather, the principle that we operate upon is that authentic revelation, which is a verse of the Quran or an authentic hadith which is sahih, that can never ever conflict or clash with sound reason which is sound, which is sarih, which is sound and not corrupt, right? And this is what defines our knowledge of what Allah revealed in general, because there are other things such as, for example, the unseen, the punishment of the grave, paradise, hellfire, things which are mentioned therein in general. But in this subject matter specifically, the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's no conflict between revelation, what Allah has informed us, and between our reason when it is used and applied correctly. So we said a good example to quickly illustrate this, to show that there can never be any conflict between reason and revelation, is that we gave the frequently repeated example of, if we take, for example, the attribute of power, and we understand the meaning of power, and then when we mention specifics, the power of the wind, the power of the water, the power of the sun, the power of the fire, in all these instances, we see that these essences are different, right? What is the wind is different to water, is different to fire, is different to the sun. All these are different essences. So just because they share the same attribute, in this case power, does not mean that their essences, the realities of their essences, are exactly the same. right? So if we can accept this fact between two created things, that they can have the same attribute but their realities are totally different, then even more so we can accept this fact between the creator and the created, right? So therefore there's nothing in our reason which contradicts what the revelation has come with, right? In this instance, it is Allah's attributes. But it could also be, for example, the grave, what happens in the grave. It can also be what happens in the hereafter, right? So there's no conflict between reason and revelation. And then we went on to explain how and why this controversy appeared regarding Allah's attributes. And the origin of this really goes back to the philosophy of the Greeks and people like Plato, Aristotle, speaking about nature, about the physics of nature, and developing a philosophy or terminology to describe this nature, right? There are bodies and there are the attributes of bodies. There are ajsam, there are jawahir, there are a'rad, right? This is all philosophical language used to describe nature. And then they also try to describe what is beyond nature, right? That which we cannot see, which is the metaphysics, what is above physics. And they came up with this idea of the being they believe to be behind the universe. They came with an idea which is just really an abstract idea, a being which has no attributes, right? Because this being has to be totally other than his creation, right? So he can't be a body, he can't have attributes, otherwise he would be a body. So really the essence of what they came with and described was something that exists in the mind only, right? Right? You do not have in external reality any being which is devoid of attributes. This is impossible. Nothing can exist except that it must have at least one attribute. So the thing that they are really describing is something that exists in the mind only, right? It doesn't exist in actual reality. So this philosophy, this, as we said, it affected the Jews, it affected the Christians, it affected the Sabi'ah before Islam, and that which we know of as the creed of the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris and Maturidis, this creed was found before Islam. And the Jews fell into it, and the Christians fell into it, and they have identical language. Right? Allah is not in a place, Allah is not in a location, Allah is not a body, Allah is not confined, Allah does not have limits. This type of philosophical description of what the Creator cannot be, using negations, using negative language, right, is other than what came in the book and the Sunnah. So this way of speaking about Allah entered into the Muslims because people like Al-Ja'ad bin Dirham, Jahm bin Safwan, they were debating with the Jews, with the Christians, with the Hindu philosophers, the Sumaniyah, with the Sabi'ah, and so on and so forth. And then this found its way into Islam. So in this way of thinking, this kalam, this philosophy, they basically say that reason necessitates that Allah cannot be a body, because everything in the universe is a body because it has attributes. And this is how we know things have a beginning, because they have attributes, and therefore the whole universe has a beginning, right? It's like a flawed argument they are trying to use to prove that the universe had a beginning. And so by proving that the universe had a beginning in this way and using this language, then they were forced to be consistent and to describe the Creator in a way which conforms to that same language, right? So Allah is not a body, He's not in a place, He's not in a location, He does not have motion, He does not, because Allah is other than the things that we see in the creation, right? So when they saw in the Quran, that in the Quran Allah has described Himself with attributes, right? That He's hearing, that He's seeing, that He loves, that He is pleased, that He becomes angry, and so on and so forth. they saw a conflict between reason and revelation, right? Reason is telling us that Allah cannot be described with attributes, otherwise He Himself would also be originated. But revelation is telling us that Allah has attributes, right? Allah is hearing, seeing, has wisdom, has mercy, loves and is pleased, and so on and so forth. So how do we now reconcile between reason and revelation? Because there's a contradiction. And so as part of the mechanism, so they had to invent mechanisms. To invent mechanisms, how do we reconcile between reason and revelation? Whereas Ahlul Sunnah do not have this problem, because we don't see there to be a conflict between reason and revelation to begin with. So from the so this is where we are now looking into the specifics and the details of the various mechanisms they used in order to reconcile between reason and revelation. So from those, you can see listed at the bottom of the sheet there, we discussed the issue of majaz and haqiqah, right? This is one of the mechanisms where they basically claimed that, you know, in the Arabic language there is majaz, there are metaphors, there are allegories, right, which do not point to realities. Another mechanism is the claim that, you know, ahad hadiths which are not mutawatir, that they do not amount to sure knowledge. They are only speculative knowledge. So we can't really trust these hadiths which mention the fact that, for example, you know, some of Allah's attributes and His actions, right, that He descends to the lowest heaven, that, you know, becomes amazed, and so on and so forth. Also from the means, which is ta'wil, and this is what we were looking at currently, right, in the previous lesson and today's lesson. And also from them is tafweed, right? So just this was to really give you a context, the context of what we are discussing, because as I said before, sometimes we might go very deeply into like a very specific topic, and we lose track of the bigger picture. So what we are doing here, when we're looking at ta'wil in detail, is looking at one of the mechanisms that these people use in order to justify their negation of the attributes of Allah, right? And so that's where we're at this point in the discussion. We are looking at rule number 5 of the 7 additional rules that Shaykh al-Islam mentions. And rule number 5 is to do with our knowledge, the nature of our knowledge of what Allah revealed to us about Himself, right? So, in the previous lesson, which you can see on the other side, ta'wil and its types. This is really a summary of the previous lesson. Because ta'wil is a mechanism they use to negate Allah's attributes, then we need to understand what it means linguistically. Simply means to return a thing to the goal or the objective that was intended by it, right? Tarji'u shay ila al-ghaya al-murada minhu. So we explained the linguistic meaning. We said there are 2 known established meanings of ta'wil, which we find in the Quran and the Sunnah. The first meaning of ta'wil is simply, it means tafsir, right? It's synonymous with tafsir. So this is to explain what is the actual intent behind someone's speech. What is the intent behind the speech? And so when we elaborate and explain, we are clarifying the intent of the speaker. So as it relates to the Quran, then we see that with this meaning of ta'wil, it means tafsir. And that's why the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he made dua for Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhuma, where he said, he made dua, allimhu ta'wil, wa allimhu ta'wil. Teach him ta'wil, meaning teach him the explanation of the book. So this is simply explaining what is the murad, what is the intent of Allah behind this verse and that verse and that verse and this verse. to elaborate and to clarify and to explain through other verses of the Quran and through the statement of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, until the murad of Allah, what does Allah actually intend by this, until it becomes clear and manifest to us, right? So this is the first meaning of ta'wil. It's synonymous with tafsir, explanation, elucidation, and so on and so forth. Now the second meaning of ta'wil is what we can basically say in English, it would be the actualization, right? The occurrence of the thing that we are being informed about, right? So for example, in the Quran, Allah says, He says, هَلْ يَنظُرُونَ إِلَّا تَأْوِيلَهُ هَلْ يَنظُرُونَ إِلَّا تَأْوِيلَهُ. Are they waiting for anything but its ta'wil, meaning the day of judgment? The ta'wil of the day of judgment. What does that mean? It simply means the actual occurrence, the thing happening, what we are being informed about, right? So the ta'wil of the day of judgment is the occurrence of the day of judgment. It becoming a reality. It coming to be, right? This is the meaning of ta'wil, where a thing that is spoken of, that is mentioned, that is reported about, it actually comes to be. Likewise, it can also relate to rulings, not only due to akhbar, but also to rulings. So for example, in relation to the commands of Allah, when Allah says, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ, establish the prayer. What is the ta'wil of that command? The ta'wil is the actual performance of the command, right? So when we establish the prayer, we are making ta'wil of the Quran. We are making ta'wil of that particular verse, meaning we are actualizing and we are performing the thing, the command that we have been ordered with. This is also known as ta'wil, right? This is the second meaning of ta'wil, meaning the actualization of the command or the prohibition, or the occurrence of the thing that we are being informed about, right? So this is a second correct meaning of ta'wil that we find in the Quran. So these two are basically very clear. We understand what they mean. We know that they have come in the Quran. This now brings us to the third meaning of ta'wil, and it is here that where we start today's lesson. The content for today's lesson starts at this point. This is where we finished previously. So this now is the ambiguous or the contentious meaning of ta'wil, right? This is where the ambiguity lies, and this is the understanding of ta'wil which is used by the people of kalam, the people of innovation, the people of deviation, and this is like an ambiguous usage. So let's first of all look at how it is defined. What's the definition of this ta'wil that they use? They say that this ta'wil is basically to divert a word, to take a word and to divert it away from the apparent and clear meaning, the obvious meaning, to a lesser known meaning on account of an evidence, that requires us to do that, right? So let's repeat that again. What do they mean by ta'wil? They mean that when we come across a text and we see that this text appears to have an obvious meaning, it's the first meaning that comes to our mind. So what we do is that we divert the text away from the obvious meaning, to a lesser known meaning, and we do that because there is an evidence that requires us to do that, or necessitates that we do that. Right? So in Arabic, it is صرف اللفظ عن المعنى الراجح إلى المعنى المرجوح لدليل يقتضيه. Right? So this is the basic process, right? Right? We come to an ayah, we come to a hadith. There's something very obvious that is apparent to us from the meaning, but then we take it away from that meaning to a less known meaning because we are claiming that there's an evidence that requires from us that we do that. Okay, so now there's two scenarios here. There are two situations here. One is that there is actually a legitimate evidence in the text itself that allows us to divert the text from the obvious meaning to the less obvious meaning, right? There's an actual evidence, right? There's an actual evidence. Inshallah, there will be a few examples very shortly. This is the first situation. In this case, this ta'wil here is no different to tafsir, the first one. It goes back to the first one, right? So if there is an actual evidence that justifies and allows us to divert this text from the obvious meaning to something else, this is no different to tafsir. Inshallah, we'll give a few examples to explain this, right? And if the evidence is not real, is not genuine, this is not genuine evidence that allows us to do this, this then is actually tahrif. This now is you are distorting the speech. You are distorting the speech now, right? So there's those two situations. So let's give some examples. The first example is the very first verse in Surah An-Nahl. Surah An-Nahl, the 16th chapter of the Quran. In this chapter, Allah Azza wa Jal, He begins by saying, أتى أمر الله فلا تستعجلوه. Okay, what does this mean? If we take the first sentence, أتى أمر الله. أتى is a past tense verb. So if we took the obvious meaning of this speech here, it would mean the command of Allah has already arrived in the past tense. So this is referring to the day of judgment. The day of judgment. So this would mean if we leave this verse and we take what is obvious from the verse and from the grammatical construction, because the past tense verb ata has been used, it would mean the day of judgment has already come and occurred, right? But there is an evidence in the verse itself which requires from us that we divert this sentence from the obvious meaning to another meaning, which is the next statement, right? In the next part of the verse, Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, فَلَا تَسْتَعْجِلُوهُ. So do not seek to hasten it. Do not seek to hasten it. Right? So we can only hasten something which is going to occur in the future. Right? Which means that what is the murad of the mutakallim? What is the intent of the speaker? The speaker meaning here it is Allah Azza wa Jal. What is he intending to say? Right? He's intending to say that the day of judgment is coming and it will occur and it will transpire. Right? That it is coming and it will occur and it will transpire and it will end. So do not seek to hasten it. فَلَا تَسْتَعْجِلُوهُ. So now we have a clear, explicit evidence in the verse itself that allows us to take that first part of the verse away from its obvious meaning, from what the words are very clearly and explicitly saying in the Arabic language to another meaning, right? So this now is what we call tafsir. This is tafsir, right? We have not, this is synonymous with tafsir. What we are doing is explaining the murad of the mutakallim. The murad of the mutakallim. So this is like a key phrase to understand. What is the murad of the mutakallim, right? And we spoke about this in our discussion about the majaz and the haqiqah, right? This is another one of those linguistic devices which are used by the Mu'tazila and by the people of Kalam to try and play games and play tricks in the language in order to justify their rejection of the attributes of Allah. In Arabic, the way the Arabic language works, there is no majaz in the Arabic language, there is only haqiqah, right? And always it is the murad of the mutakallim which explains what is the reality he is intending to say, right? And that is what we are trying to decipher in the Arabic language. What is the murad of the mutakallim? So when I say, for example, that Khalid is a lion, or Khalid fought like a lion, right? What is the murad of the mutakallim? And that is what is the haqiqah that the speaker is conveying, right? So the murad, the intent here is that Khalid in his fighting has the attributes of bravery and courage and fierceness that are possessed by a lion, right? And this is my murad. This is the murad of the mutakallim. And it is pointing to a reality. It's a haqiqah, right? There's no notion of majaz, of metaphor, of allegory, or anything like this present here in the Arabic language, right? So always, when you understand the murad of the mutakallim, this then becomes tafsir. This is tafsir, right? So what we have done here in interpreting this verse is tafsir. This is tafsir. It is not the ta'wil intended by the people of Kalams, right? So when they come and engage in a debate or an argument, right, and they say, but look at this verse, Ata amrullah, fala tasta'jiluh. You just made ta'wil of this ayah. This is ta'wil. And what they mean by the word ta'wil is what they are doing with the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So when they say Allah's hand, right, bal yadahu mabsutatan, hand means power. They are saying this is ta'wil just like this is ta'wil. But no, that's not true. Because what we have done here, Ata amrullah fala tasta'jiluh, is tafsir. Is tafsir. Because in the verse itself is an explicit evidence that shows to us what is the murad of the mutakallim. What is the intent of Allah? The intent of Allah here is to say the day of judgment is coming and it will occur and it will transpire. So do not seek to hasten it. This now is tafsir. What you are doing over there, bal yadahu mabsutatan, is you are taking the word two hands, which Allah has annexed to Himself. He's ascribed them to Himself, bal yadahu mabsutatan, and you are making a tahrif. You are distorting the word from its proper meaning, and you are saying yad here means power. And the language does not allow you to make that interpretation, because what do you mean power? It says bal yadahu. Two powers, Allah's two powers are outstretched. How does that even make sense? So what you are doing is tahrif. What we are doing is tafsir, right? So you must be very clear in your mind the distinction between what amounts to tafsir, where we have an actual genuine evidence that justifies us not understanding the apparent obvious meaning and going to another meaning, right? This is one example. A second example which is similar is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنِ فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنِ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ. Right? So, if we were to read the obvious apparent meaning, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنِ, when you have read the Quran, because here قَرَأْتَ is in the past tense, right? It's in the Madi past tense. فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنِ, when you have read the Quran, then seek refuge from Allah. Seek refuge with Allah from the shaitan, from the accursed shaitan. Seek refuge with Allah from the accursed shaitan. So this would imply, the obvious meaning would imply that you seek refuge in Allah from the shaitan after you've completed the recitation. And this is not correct, because we know that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he commanded, and he himself would also seek refuge with Allah from the accursed shaitan at the commencement of the recitation of the Quran. So we have an authentic evidence to show that what Allah intends is that when you desire to embark upon reciting the Quran and engaging in your recitation and completing your recitation, then commence with the isti'adha, seeking refuge with Allah from the accursed shaitan. So, in other words, we have clear evidence to justify this interpretation, to take away the word, in this case it is a past tense, qara'ta, and to turn it into some other meaning. And in the Arabic language anyway, it is known and acceptable that in the Arabic language you can use a past tense verb to mean a present or future tense, and vice versa. So this is acceptable usage. Okay, now, how does this contrast, this so-called ta'wil, with what the people of innovation do in relation to the attributes of Allah? We already gave one example, بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, how they basically misinterpret the verses of the attributes. A second example, a famous example we use all the time, الرحمن على العرش استوى. الرحمن على العرش استوى. That the most gracious ascended above the throne. Here the word istawa is used. Now what these people of Kalam will do is they will come and they will say, the word istawa, don't you know that when we go back to the Arabic dictionaries, and it can have 15 different meanings, it can mean this and it can mean that and it can mean this and it can mean that, and they give all these different meanings. And so which meaning how do you know which meaning it means? Right? And so the brief answer is, first of all, Allah Azza wa Jal used the verb istawa with the preposition ala. And when it's used with the preposition ala, it can only ever have one meaning. Right? So the meaning is very clear in the verse itself by using the preposition ala. Ar-Rahman ascended over his throne. First of all, that's the first thing. Secondly, they try to distort the word istawa, and they say, well, what it really means is istawla. Istawla. They add a lam after the waw. Istawla. What's the difference here? Istawla means to conquer the throne. Allah conquered the throne. Right? This is wrong. First of all, the preposition ala has been used. You wouldn't use that. You wouldn't use that if you wanted to use istawla. Oh, I mean, maybe you would, but the fact is that the meaning itself becomes corrupt, because you are saying Allah conquered the throne. You only conquer something if you didn't have dominion and power over it to begin with, and therefore you conquered it. This implies that Allah did not have dominion over his throne. So now you've tried to flee from one meaning, and you've ended up with a meaning which is even more corrupt, right? So this is what happens when you try to play these games, you try to play these tricks, you try to, swerve away from the correct and true meanings. You end up in even greater misguidance. So to summarize this discussion then, because we've come to an end to the section on ta'wil, these types of interpretations are false. They are futile, because there is no evidence for these interpretations they are making. So this is not tafsir. This is tahrif. This is distortion of the book of Allah. It is distortion it is altering what is the intent of Allah behind this speech. And so as we can see, this type of ta'wil is not the ta'wil which is tafsir, nor is it the other ta'wil which is the ta'wil which is the occurrence or the actualization of a thing, whether it is a khabar or whether it is an amr, a talab, right? A request, a command or a prohibition. This is something else that is being fabricated by the people of Kalam in order to justify their negation of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when they make these ta'wils, there are hundreds and hundreds of these ta'wils. In fact, this is what they began to do. The people of Kalam in the 2nd century after Hijrah, this is their understanding of what Tawheed is, right? Tawheed to them is to purify Allah, to absolve Allah from having the properties of bodies. Right? This is their Tawheed. This is Tawheed which is the Aristotelian Tawheed. This is the Tawheed based upon the language of Aristotle. Right? To negate from Allah the properties of bodies. Allah is not a body, He's not in a place, He's not in a location, He does not have any emotion. All of this negative language, this is their idea of what Tawheed is. And so therefore, Tawheed for them is to systematically go through the Quran and go through the Sunnah, and whenever they come across anything which they believe wrongly in their minds, that this text implies that Allah is a body, because it affirms an attribute for Him. Allah hears, Allah sees, Allah becomes pleased, Allah becomes angry. In their mind, their thought process is, hang on, Allah becomes angry. But anger is a human passion. And passion is a defect and a weakness. And this passion can only be felt if it's in a body. So how can Allah have a body? So therefore now we must somehow neutralize this text. And I gave you the similitude in the previous lesson. I said the way to think what these people are doing is that these people believe that the Quran is like a thobe, a white thobe. And on this thobe there are dirty stains. Right? And these stains in the Quran are the stains of tashbih and tajseem. Right? That in the Quran there are verses which if we read them and leave them as they are, it is basically tajseem. Allah made istiwa above the arsh. Allah has a face. Allah becomes angry. Allah becomes pleased. This is like a stain on the Quran. So how can we clean and purify the Quran of these stains? Well, one mechanism is ta'wil. Right? This false ta'wil that they are speaking of, that we come to these verses and we say hand means power, face means countenance, Allah's anger means his intent to punish, Allah's pleasure means His intent to reward. And you explain all these things away, and you explain all the attributes away. Right? So this is one way of basically cleaning the Quran from these stains. But obviously, with this method, they know that they are speculating. Because when you make these ta'wils, how do you know that this ta'wil, this interpretation, or this distortion rather, is what Allah actually intended by this speech. They know they are speculating, right? And so they don't feel comfortable in their hearts with ta'wil because it amounts to speaking about Allah without knowledge. How do you know your ta'wil is correct? Did you receive revelation from Allah that when you say that بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, both of Allah's hands are outstretched, that Allah actually means both of His powers are outstretched? How did you know this is what Allah intends? Who told you that? Did an angel come to you? Did you receive revelation? They don't know that. And they know that they are speculating, and they know that they are speaking about Allah without sure knowledge. So this brings about uneasiness in their hearts, which is why ta'wil is not really so therefore they then go to another method, which is tafweed, right? So ta'wil is like a mild type of soap that you use to remove the stains from the thob, or the stains of tashbih and tajseem in the Quran. But then you need something heavy duty to erase everything, right? Something like domestos or something like this. So you take the domestos and you soak the thob in the domestos, and it gets rid of all of the actual heavy, dark, deep stains, and the thob ends up being white, right? So in the same way, they need something industrial strength to apply to the Quran to erase every trace of tashbih and tajseem from the Quran. And what is that? That is tafweed. So here what they say is, well, we have to assume that we are completely and utterly ignorant of the meanings of these texts. These texts have no meanings. There are no meanings to begin with. And we don't know the meanings, or it's impossible for us to know their meanings. Only Allah knows the meanings. We are just ignorant people. The messengers were ignorant people. The messenger did not know the meanings either. He was ignorant as well of what was revealed in the Quran. So by using this principle, you have now erased every meaning from the Quran that you consider to be a stain on the Quran, the stain of tajseem and tashbih, right? So ta'wil is the soft method, and tafweed is the harsh, powerful method from the various mechanisms that they have. So anyhow, this ends our discussion of the subject of ta'wil itself. And so inshallah, once this is now clear, we should be very clear that if we ever engage with these types of people, we can clearly see their misunderstanding of the meaning of ta'wil, right? They will define their ta'wil to be, well, you have an obvious meaning, and then because there's an evidence, you take the text away from that obvious meaning to another meaning, and all along they are thinking that they somehow have evidence for what they are doing, but in every example they bring, there actually is no evidence, right? And what they are doing is playing games with the language, playing trickery with the language, to either deceive people, or maybe they themselves are kind of confused and they don't really know what they are doing, right? So this should allow us to be very clear on this issue, and how to answer these people as well, to explain to them, no, hang on, you've misunderstood the meaning of ta'wil. Ta'wil in the Quran comes with these two meanings, right? With tafsir on the one hand, or secondly with the khabar and the talab, it means something else. But what you are doing is tahrif, right? And you don't have any genuine evidence for what you're doing. Therefore, this is tahrif, it is not tafsir. So all of that brings us to a conclusion for that particular section. We now move to the next section in the book. And so here, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, in his summary, Fasal, chapter, اعلم أن الله تعالى وصف القرآن بأنه محكم وبأنه متشابه وبأن بعده محكم وبعده متشابه. Okay, what we are doing here is we are moving now and looking at the Quran. And three different ways how the Quran has described the Quran. Right? Three different ways how the Quran has described the Quran. What's the connection to this topic, to the previous topic? Because remember, all of this is principle number 5, right? So I just want to stop here for a moment. Just to tie everything together. So, principle number 5 is to do with what? It's to do with the nature of our knowledge of what Allah has informed us about Himself. Right? It's to do with the nature of our knowledge. What's the nature of our knowledge? The Shaykh explained, there are two aspects to our knowledge. One aspect is where the ma'na is ma'loom. Right? So we understand the meaning of what Allah is informing us. But on the other hand, when it comes to the reality, haqiqa, kayfiyah, then we are ignorant. We don't have knowledge in those affairs, right? That's the nature of our knowledge. So connected to that is the issue of ta'wil, right? Ta'wil. Because if the Quran is revealed to us and we have to understand its meanings and we have to implement its teachings, then the word ta'wil, which can mean either explanation or it can mean the actual performance or the actualization of the Quran, right? So ta'wil in meaning, or meaning tafsir, or ta'wil in acting and implementing the Quran, right? That's our concern with the Quran. So these are two correct meanings of ta'wil. To either understand what we are being informed about, tafsir, what is the intent of Allah behind this verse or behind that verse, what's the meaning that we need to understand, or this command or this prohibition to act upon it, right? This is the ta'wil of the Quran, the actualization of the Quran, putting the Quran into practice, right? These are the two meanings of ta'wil that have come in the Quran and the Sunnah. As for this type of ta'wil, where you basically, you are really distorting the speech of Allah by claiming to have an evidence to do so, where you don't, you're just playing linguistic tricks with the, in the language. And this is tahrif. This is distortion of the Quran. This discussion that we've just completed now leads to another discussion, which is, well, the Quran itself, how has the Quran described itself? It's described itself in 3 ways. And these people, the people of Kalam, are going to use this as another shubha, as another misconception, right? They're going to come to us and say, oh, look, in the Quran, Allah says that there are some verses which are decisive and there are some verses which are ambiguous, right? And where the meaning is not known. And so therefore the verses of the attributes are from among those verses, right? So this is now another area where these people are going to present a shubha. Just like in the issue of ta'wil, they present a shubha, right? Where they say, well, we are doing ta'wil of the Quran, right? We're doing ta'wil of the attributes. But they're not doing ta'wil, they're doing tahrif of the Quran, right? So in the same way, another connected topic, subtopic here then, is the Quran itself and how it has been described, right? That it is muhkam and it is mutashabih, and then parts of it are muhkam and parts of it are mutashabih, right? So we are going to study this area. We are going to look at these 3 different descriptions, and again to clarify the misconception so that we are not deceived by the shubha, by this misconception, right? So, as the Shaykh said, Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he said, know that Allah the Exalted has described the Quran, and Allah Ta'ala wasaf al-Quran بأنه muhkam. He has described the Quran that it is muhkam, meaning it is decisive, It is clear, decisive. And وَبِأَنَّهُ مُتَشَابِهٌ. Mutashabih. Right? So the whole of the Quran is muhkam. That's been mentioned in the Quran. The whole of the Quran is mutashabih. That's come in the Quran as well. And وَبِأَنَّ بَعْدَهُ مُحْكَمٌ وَبَعْدَهُ مُتَشَابِهٌ. And then there's other verses which say some of the Quran is muhkam, some of the Quran is mutashabih. So how do we make sense of these three descriptions, right? What are the three categories? The Quran as a whole is muhkam, number one. Number two, the Quran as a whole is mutashabih. And number three, some of the Quran is muhkam, some of the Quran is mutashabih. How do we understand these three descriptions? First of all, before we go in that direction, let's mention the actual verses from the Quran where each of these three types are mentioned. As for the first, Allah Azza wa Jal, He says in Surah Yunus, chapter 10, verse number 1, تلك آيات الكتاب تلك آيات الكتاب الحكيم. Those are the verses of Al-Kitab Al-Hakim. Al-Kitab Al-Hakim. The wise book. The book has been described as Al-Hakim. Al-Hakim. So the whole of the kitab is described as all wise. Al-Hakim. Another clearer verse is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, Alif Lam Mim, Kitabun Uhkimat Ayatuh. Uhkimat Ayatuh. ثم فصلت من لدن حكيم خبير. Alif Lam Mim, a book whose verses have been uhkimat, meaning that they have been made precise and exact. And then ثم فصلت, then they have been explained by the one who is Hakim, all wise, Khabir, all aware, Khabir, all aware, all knowing, all aware. So here in these two verses you can see that the whole of the book and its verses have been described with ihkam, meaning precision, exactness, definiteness, whatever the word is, that they are definitive, exact, precise, clear, apparent, right? So this is one description of the Quran as a whole. The second category, or an example of the second type, is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal in Surah Az-Zumar, the 39th chapter, verse number 23, in which Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, Allahu nazzala ahsan al-hadithi kitaban mutashabihan. Kitaban mutashabihan. Allah has sent down or revealed the most beautiful speech, the best of speech, a book which is mutashabih. A book which is mutashabih. And here mutashabih meaning a book which is, it is consistent, it is congruent, parts of it resemble other parts, it's as a whole. Inshallah, we'll come to the meaning in a bit more detail shortly. But just to give you the evidences, right? So this is the evidence for the whole book being mutashabih, because Allah Azza wa Jal, He said kitaban mutashabihan, right? So He described the kitab with the adjective mutashabih. So the whole of the kitab is mutashabih, the whole of the kitab is muhkam, as we saw in the first two verses. Now the third category is the statement of Allah Azza wa Jal, the verse that we were discussing previously in Surah Ali Imran, verse number 7 in the chapter on Ali Imran, chapter number 3, surah number 3. هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. He is the one who sent down the book upon you. From it are verses which are decisive and clear. They are the essence of the book. And there are others which are ambiguous. They are ambiguous, right? So notice here how the meaning of mutashabih in this verse is different to the meaning of mutashabih in the previous verse. They mean two different things, right? And we're going to explain the difference between those meanings. So, I think what we can do, inshallah, we can maybe bring this lesson to a close. So, we've introduced the three categories. We've given the evidences for the three categories. The Quran is muhkam as a whole. The Quran is mutashabih as a whole. And within the Quran, there are verses which are muhkam, decisive, clear, and verses which are mutashabih, which are ambiguous. So now we need to look at what is the correct understanding of each of these three descriptions of the Quran. And the purpose behind doing this is again to dispel another misconception that is brought by the people of Kalam, the people of philosophy and rhetoric, where they try to trick us into believing that the verses of the attributes are from the ambiguous verses, meaning ambiguous in meaning, right? So they can therefore erase these meanings to justify the negation of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the correct meanings of each of these three descriptions of the Quran, we'll follow that up insha'Allah ta'ala in the next lesson. So for now, we'll conclude our discussion here and end our lesson. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.